They say that love conquers all. But in the frozen, blood-soaked expanse of the Dakota Territory in 1876, love wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. This was the height of the Indian Wars, a dark chapter in history where the prairie grass was stained red and mercy was a forgotten language. The United States Cavalry and the Lakota Sioux were locked in a cycle of brutal, unforgiving slaughter. It was a time of total war, where the instructions given to every soldier and every warrior were simple: kill or be killed. To the Army, he was a decorated officer, a man of discipline sworn to uphold the flag and clear the plains. To the tribe, she was a protector of her people, witnessing the slow, agonizing destruction of her world. By the laws of their nations, by the color of their skin, and by the uniforms they wore, they were born enemies. But in the silence between the gunshots, something impossible happened. While their people prepared for annihilation, these two crossed the battle lines, not to fight, but to fall in love. It started with a glance across a river, a moment of hesitation where a trigger wasn't pulled. It grew into a romance that defied logic, defied loyalty, and defied the United States government. Imagine the terror of it. They met in secret, under the cover of moonless nights, hiding in ravines and tall grass. They risked everything: court-martial, execution for treason, and total exile, just to share a few stolen moments, to whisper in languages they were only just beginning to learn from one another. But a secret like this cannot live forever in a war zone. As the drums beat louder and the regiments moved in for the final strike, the walls began to close in. They were forced to make a choice that no human should ever have to make: choose your people or choose your heart. This is not a fairy tale of the Wild West. There are no heroes riding off into the sunset. This is the gut-wrenching true story of the incredible risks they took, the paranoia that consumed them, and the ultimate heartbreaking sacrifice they made when the world tried to tear them apart. This is Blood on the Prairie. To understand how impossible this love was, you have to understand the world they lived in. It was the spring of 1876. The location, the vast, wind-swept emptiness of the Dakota Territory. To the untrained eye, the prairie was a sea of grass and sky, a place of infinite freedom. But to those who lived there, it was a cage made of fear. The tension had been building for years. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed less than a decade earlier, had promised the Black Hills to the Sioux people forever. But forever ended the moment gold was found in the streams. Thousands of prospectors swarmed into sacred land, hungry for wealth, and the United States government, rather than holding them back, sent the cavalry to protect them. This betrayal turned the plains into a pressure cooker. For the Lakota, this wasn't just a border dispute, it was an existential fight for survival. They watched as the buffalo, their food, their shelter, their spirit, were slaughtered by the thousands, leaving carcasses rotting in the sun. They watched as wooden forts rose up like scars on the land. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were gathering the tribes, no longer willing to retreat. The message was clear: no more treaties, no more lies. Inside the U.S. Army forts, the mood was grim. These weren't the glorified battles of paintings. This was a life of grueling isolation. Soldiers, many of them fresh immigrants or weary veterans of the Civil War, lived in constant paranoia. Every rustle in the tall grass could be an ambush. Every patrol could be their last. They were fighting an enemy they didn't understand in a land that seemed to want them dead. The hatred between the two sides was absolute. It was fueled by language barriers, by propaganda, and by the spilled blood of friends and brothers. There was no middle ground. You were either blue or you were red. To cross that line wasn't just treason, it was suicide. The space between the Army fort and the Lakota encampments was a dead zone, a stretch of land where mercy did not exist. And yet it was precisely here, in this atmosphere of suffocating hate, that the impossible happened. The powder keg was set, the fuse was lit, and two people were about to step right into the fire. Wars are fought by nations, but they are lived by individuals. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, we must first understand the two lonely souls destined to collide in the middle of this chaos. They were two people who, by all rights, should have been content to kill one another. But they shared a secret affliction. They were both ghosts in their own worlds. First, there was Lieutenant Silas Thorne. Thorne was not the typical blood-hungry cavalryman that the propaganda posters depicted. He was a man hollowed out by violence. Before he ever set foot on the prairie, he had waded through the mud and gore of the Civil War back east. He had seen the fields of Antietam and the trenches of Petersburg. He had watched his own brothers die for a cause he believed in, only to find that victory tasted like ash. He came west not for glory or gold, but for silence, hoping the frontier's endless vastness would drown the screams of his past. Instead, he became another cog in a machine of death. While fellow officers gambled, downed cheap whiskey, and bragged of slaughtering savages come spring, Thorne kept apart. He spent his evenings alone in his quarters, oil lamp casting long shadows across timber walls as he sketched the wild landscape in a leather-bound journal. Discipline armored him, uniform, pristine, saber gleaming. Yet his eyes carried ancient weariness. He studied the Lakota not with hatred, but a strange, dark curiosity. A people defending their homes just as he once had. A soldier who had lost his taste for war, trapped in a uniform he no longer honored. On the other side of the dead zone lived Winona. Her name meant firstborn daughter, and in her village, she was known as a woman who walked between worlds. While the young men of the tribe painted their faces for war and the elders debated strategy around the council fires, Winona was a healer. Her hands were not made for the bow or the lance, but for the grinding of herbs and the stitching of wounds. She had seen the cost of this war up close. She had washed the blood from her brother's skin after skirmishes with the blue coats. She had sung the death songs for cousins who never came home. But Winona possessed a dangerous quality for a woman in her position. She was intensely observant. She did not just see the long knives as a faceless swarm of locusts. She watched them from the ridges. She saw them shivering in the winter cold, saw them burying their dead with heads bowed low. She realized that these invaders were men, frightened, freezing, and far from home. This empathy isolated her. When she spoke of the enemy with anything other than vitriol, she was met with scowls. Her people were desperate, backed into a corner, and there was no room for nuance. Like Thorne, she felt alone in a crowd of her own kin. She would often wander far from the safety of the camp, venturing near the riverbanks to gather sage and willow bark, seeking the solitude that the crowded teepees couldn't provide. So, here they were. Two outliers. Silas Thorne, the weary veteran who wrote poetry in his head while cleaning his revolver. Winona, the healer who looked at the enemy and wondered if they, too, had mothers waiting for them. They were separated by language, by culture, by a century of history, and by the barrel of a gun. But they were united by a profound, aching loneliness. They were both looking for something, anything, that made sense in a world gone mad. Fate was about to give them exactly what they were looking for, but it would come at a price neither of them could imagine. The stage was set for their paths to cross, not on a battlefield, but in a moment of quiet that would shatter their lives forever. It happened in late April. The snow was finally beginning to melt, turning the hard-packed earth into a slurry of mud and ice. The river that separated the Army's patrol routes from the Lakota hunting grounds was swollen with the thaw. Silas Thorne had ridden out alone that afternoon. It was a breach of protocol. Officers were never supposed to leave the fort without an escort, but the claustrophobia of the barracks had become suffocating. He told the sentries he was scouting the ridge. But in truth, he had ridden down to the riverbank to wash the dust from his face and to find a moment of quiet. He tied his horse to a cottonwood tree and knelt by the water, the cold shock of the river numbing his hands. He didn't hear her approach. The wind was gusting through the canyon, masking the sound of her moccasins on the stone. Winona was there for willow bark. The river willow was potent medicine for fevers, and the winter had been harsh on the tribe's elders. She was focused on her task, her knife working quickly to strip the bark, her back turned to the tree line. The moment of discovery was sharp and sudden. Thorne's horse whinnied. Winona spun around, her knife still in her hand. Thorne, reacting on pure instinct, the muscle memory of a soldier who had survived 4 years of civil war, had his Colt revolver drawn and leveled at her chest before he had even fully stood up. Time seemed to freeze. In any other circumstance, this would have been the end of the story. The standing orders were to treat any Lakota encountered outside the reservation boundaries as a hostile combatant. Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. He saw the knife in her hand. He saw the fear in her eyes, wide, dark, and terrified. Winona did not run. She knew she could not outrun a bullet. She stood frozen against the backdrop of the rushing water, clutching the bundle of willow bark to her chest as if it could protect her. She waited for the flash, the noise, and the darkness. But the shot never came. Thorne stared at her over the iron sights of his gun. He looked for the warrior paint, the anger, the threat. But he only saw a woman shivering in the biting wind, gathering medicine. He saw the frayed edges of her buckskin dress. He saw a human being who was just as cold and tired as he was. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tension broke. Thorne exhaled, a cloud of white breath vanishing into the air. He did not holster his weapon, he wasn't stupid, but he lowered the barrel until it pointed at the mud between them. He took a step back. He raised his free hand, palm open, a universal sign. "I will not fire." Winona watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the hesitation in the blue coat. She saw him lower the weapon of death. It was an act of mercy she had been told was impossible. For 10 long seconds, they just looked at each other. No words were spoken, neither knew the other's language, and words would have been useless anyway. The dialogue was entirely in their eyes, a question asked and answered. "Why are we doing this?" Thorne nodded once, stiffly. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back up the ridge without looking back. Winona remained by the river for a long time after he had gone, staring at the hoof prints left in the mud. She touched the spot on her chest where the bullet should have struck. She had gone to the river to find medicine, but she had found something far more dangerous. A reason to believe the enemy was human. The line had been crossed. The war was still raging, but for Silas and Winona, the first shot had been fired in a different kind of revolution. It should have been a one-time event. A strange anecdote Thorne would write in his journal and forget. But curiosity is a powerful force, stronger even than fear. 3 days later, Thorne returned to the river. He told himself he was just patrolling the perimeter, but his heart raced as he neared the cottonwood tree. She was there. She hadn't run away. She was waiting. This time there were no guns drawn. There was only a cautious, fragile silence. They stood 10 feet apart, separated by a chasm of culture and war. Thorne broke the silence first. He pointed to the red-tailed hawk circling above them and spoke the word, hawk. Winona looked up, then back at him. She shook her head and pointed, speaking her own word in Lakota. Chetang. Thorne repeated it, stumbling over the guttural sounds. Winona smiled. A small, guarded thing, but genuine. In that moment, the wall between them cracked. Over the next few weeks, the river became their sanctuary. It was a bubble existing outside of time. While the fort buzzed with rumors of the coming campaign and the Lakota camp prepared for the summer hunt, Silas and Winona built a world of their own in the tall grass. They communicated through a language of fragments. They drew maps in the river mud to explain where they came from. He sketched her portrait in his leather journal, capturing the strength in her jaw and the sadness in her eyes. She taught him which berries were sweet and which would stop a fever. They began to exchange gifts, tokens of a life the other would never know. Thorne gave her a small silver shaving mirror. Winona had never seen her own reflection so clearly before. She stared at it for minutes, touching her face, seeing herself not as a survivor of war, but as a woman. In return, she gave him a strip of leather, intricately beaded with the geometric patterns of her family. It was a talisman for protection. Thorne tied it around his wrist, hiding it beneath the cuff of his blue uniform, a secret piece of the enemy pressed against his pulse. It wasn't long before the distance between them vanished entirely. The 10 feet became 5, then 2, then touch. The first time they held hands, it felt more dangerous than the muzzle of a gun. It was an act of rebellion. They knew, logically, that this was madness. Every minute they spent together was a roll of the dice. If a scouting party from either side crested the ridge, they would be dead before they could stand up. But the danger acted like a drug. It heightened every sensation. The smell of the sage, the warmth of the sun, the sound of her laugh. It all felt sharper, more vivid, because they knew it could be snatched away in an instant. They were falling in love, deeply, hopelessly, and tragically. They had found peace in the middle of a war zone, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. Peace is the first casualty of war. Secrets in a war zone are like cracks in a dam. You can patch them for a while, but eventually the pressure becomes too great and the whole thing bursts. For Silas and Winona, the collapse started with small mistakes. Complacency had set in. They had begun to believe their own lie, that they were invisible. It began in the Lakota camp. Winona's brother, a young warrior named Black Fox, had been watching her. He had noticed her long absences. He had noticed the way she looked toward the river, not with fear, but with longing. One evening, while Winona was tending to a fire, the small silver shaving mirror slipped from the folds of her dress. It hit the ground with a soft clink, reflecting the firelight. Black Fox snatched it up before she could move. He turned it over in his hands. It was fine silver, stamped with a manufacturer's mark from St. Louis. It was a white man's object. He looked at his sister, his face twisting not just with anger, but with betrayal. He didn't strike her, but the look he gave her was worse than a blow. It was the look one gives a traitor. He kept the mirror, a silent piece of evidence that hung over her head like a blade. Meanwhile, at the fort, the suspicion was far louder. Lieutenant Thorne's commanding officer, Captain Miller, was a man who smelled sedition like a hound smells fear. Miller had noticed Thorne's muddy boots, mud from the riverbank, not the parade ground. He had noticed Thorne's refusal to join in the dark conversations about clearing the savages. The breaking point came during a routine inspection. As Thorne raised his arm to salute, his sleeve rode up just an inch. The colorful, beaded Lakota amulet Winona had given him flashed in the sunlight. Captain Miller's eyes snapped to it instantly. He grabbed Thorne's wrist, twisting it violently to expose the leather band. The barracks went dead silent. "A trophy, Lieutenant?" Miller sneered, his face inches from Thorne's. "Or a token?" Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He managed to lie, his voice steady despite the cold sweat on his back. He claimed he had taken it off a dead scout months ago. Miller stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, searching for the lie. He slowly released Thorne's wrist, but the message was clear. "I am watching you." The safety of the river was gone. The next time they met, the joy was replaced by terror. Winona told him about her brother. Thorne told her about the captain. The reality crashed down on them. They weren't just risking their own lives anymore. They were risking a diplomatic incident that could trigger a massacre. The war wasn't just on the horizon, it was in their tents, in their barracks, and in their families. They realized with sinking hearts that they could no longer live in two worlds. The middle ground had vanished. They had to choose: stay and die as enemies, or run and die as lovers. The timeline for their survival had been measured in months, then weeks. Now, abruptly, it was measured in hours. The hammer dropped on the morning of May 17th. In the fort, the bugles sounded a call that Thorne had been dreading. The orders came down from headquarters. The campaign was beginning early. General Custer was moving the 7th Cavalry out. The order was total war. The regiment was to sweep the river valley and clear out any resistance. Thorne's platoon was assigned the lead scout position. He realized with a sick feeling in his gut that in 48 hours, he wouldn't be meeting Winona at the river. He would be ordered to burn her village. Across the water, Winona received her own ultimatum. The scouts had seen the dust clouds of the approaching army. The elders made the decision to break camp immediately. They were moving west to join the great gathering of tribes under Sitting Bull. If Winona went with them, she would disappear into the vastness of the territory, likely never to see Thorne again, unless it was across a battlefield. That night, they met at the river for what they knew might be the last time. The air was thick with the smell of rain. They didn't even embrace. The fear was too palpable. They knelt in the mud, trembling. Thorne spoke first, his voice ragged. He told her about the attack orders. He told her he couldn't do it. He couldn't burn her home. Winona told him about the migration. She told him that if they stayed, they died. If they separated, they died inside. So they made the pact. They would not go west with the tribe, and they would not go south with the army. They would go north. They would head for the grandmother's land, Canada. It was a legendary sanctuary where the Queen's law protected the tribes from the US Army. It was 1,000 miles of brutal, unforgiving wilderness away. But it was their only chance. The plan was desperate. The time, midnight, 2 nights from now. The night of the new moon, when the prairie would be pitched in absolute darkness. The place, a jagged limestone formation known as the Devil's Tooth, 3 miles north of the perimeter. The signal, the call of a coyote 3 times. Thorne would desert his post, a crime punishable by firing squad. He would steal 2 of the Army's best horses and supplies. Winona would slip away during the chaos of breaking camp, leaving behind her family, her culture, and her name. It was a suicide pact, disguised as an escape plan. They knew the odds. They knew that if the elements didn't kill them, the bounty hunters would. But as they looked at each other in the dark, they realized that the fear of death was nothing compared to the fear of living without the other. They touched foreheads one last time, a silent vow. Then, they vanished back into the shadows to prepare. The die was cast. The next time they saw each other, they would either be free or they would be dead. The night of the new moon arrived, pitching the prairie into a darkness so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Thorne was waiting at the Devil's Tooth. He had managed to secure 2 horses and supplies, but the theft hadn't gone unnoticed. As he waited in the shadows of the rock formation, he could see the distant flicker of torches moving out from the fort. The army was awake. The alarm had been raised. Winona arrived 20 minutes late. She was breathless, her clothes torn from the brush. She hadn't slipped away unnoticed either. A party of tribal scouts was tracking her, moving fast. They were trapped. To the south, the torches of the cavalry were closing in. To the east, the scouts were cutting off the pass. The only way out was the narrow ravine leading north, a path wide enough for single-file riding, but dangerous in the dark. They mounted the horses, but as they turned toward the ravine, a gunshot cracked through the air. A scout had spotted them. Then came the shout of a soldier. The pincer movement was complete. They had perhaps 60 seconds before they were surrounded. Thorne looked at the ravine, then at the horses. He realized with a sickening clarity that 2 horses moving together would be too slow, too loud. They would be run down within a mile. Someone had to hold the entrance to the ravine. Someone had to make noise, create a diversion, and draw the fire to give the other a head start into the darkness. Thorne made the choice before Winona could even speak. He dismounted. "You go," he whispered, pressing the reins of the stronger horse into her hands. "Ride until the stars change. Do not look back." Winona grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading, tears finally spilling over. She tried to pull him up, but he pulled away. He took the beaded amulet from his wrist, the one she had given him, and pressed it into her palm. "I will buy you time," he said. "Go." He slapped the flank of her horse hard. The animal bolted, carrying Winona into the black mouth of the ravine. Thorne didn't watch her go. He turned back toward the approaching lights, drew his revolver, and fired 3 shots into the air, not to kill, but to announce his position. "Over here!" he screamed, drawing the attention of every soldier and scout for miles. The darkness erupted with gunfire. Thorne took cover behind the rocks, firing back, making as much noise as an entire platoon. He held the line for 10 minutes. 10 minutes of fury, 10 minutes of distraction. When they finally overran his position, they found him out of ammunition, bleeding from a shoulder wound, but alive. He was on his knees, but he was smiling. He looked toward the north, where the silence was deep and unbroken. He knew she was gone. He knew she was safe. Winona made it to Canada. She disappeared into the vastness of the grandmother's land, finding refuge with a band of Cree. She lived a long life, surviving the end of the buffalo and the changing of the world. But she never married. When she died 40 years later, her family found a small, tarnished silver shaving mirror wrapped in deerskin and a US Cavalry button. She had kept them as holy relics. Silas Thorne was not executed. The army, fearing a scandal if they executed a decorated hero, court-martialed him and sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor at Leavenworth Prison. He was stripped of his rank and his name. He served every day of his sentence in silence. He never spoke of the night at the Devil's Tooth. He never told them which way she went. He died a free man, but a lonely one, sketching portraits of a woman with dark eyes in cheap notebooks until his hands were too arthritic to hold a pencil. They never saw each other again. History tells us that the West was won with gunpowder and steel. But in the space between the history books, 2 people proved that even in a world of hate, love is the only thing worth dying for. Their names were erased from the official records. Their story was buried under the dust of the prairie. But stories like this deserve to be remembered. If Silas and Winona's journey moved you, please honor their memory by liking this video. It helps us tell more forgotten stories of history. And if you want to see more true tales of romance, tragedy, and the Wild West that the history books left out, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. What do you think happened to Winona in the North? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next story.